History remembers Anne Boleyn as the queen who lost her head. But before the axe, before the crown, there was a woman who learned how to rule men long before she ruled England. Born into ambition and exile, she wandered through the glittering corruption of European courts, where lust was a language and survival was an art. This is not the story of her death, but of her becoming, of how a courtesan's smile could unmake a kingdom, how desire could rewrite religion itself. This is the untold descent. From courtesan to queen, before she ever met Henry Tudor, Anne Boleyn had already walked through the inferno of royal power. The English girl was sent to France at 13, a pawn in her father's endless climb toward influence. But what awaited her across the Channel was not a finishing school, it was a battlefield disguised as paradise. At the French court of Francois I, virtue was a costume one wore briefly, then discarded in the name of survival. The air smelled of perfume and sign, and the young Anne watched as noble women traded honor for influence. Queens wept behind silk curtains while mistresses laughed in golden halls. It was here that Anne discovered the real architecture of power, that a woman's silence could command more attention than her words, that a well-timed glance could unseat a priest. She served in the household of Queen Claude, a woman devout and restrained, but even there the corruption leaked through the marble floors. Courtiers whispered of the king's endless conquests, of secret chambers where laughter turned to sobs. The young English girl learned to move quietly, to listen, to never speak more than necessary. She saw how innocence was used as bait, how purity was a weapon that men never expected to be turned against them. Years passed, and the awkward girl from Kent transformed into something far more dangerous, a woman who understood her own value. Anne learned the French art of restraint, to reveal just enough to ignite desire and hide enough to command it. She studied fashion, poetry, the music of flattery. She observed the queen's confessor trembling before a whispered rumor, and she began to understand that power was not in the crown. It was in the eyes of those who knew how to make others need them. The court's darkness fascinated her. She watched a duchess destroyed by jealousy, her jewels confiscated, and her name erased. She watched a maid smother her newborn in silence, fearing disgrace more than damnation. These memories would never leave her. They became the stones in the foundation of her ambition, the knowledge that every royal smile concealed rot, that every act of piety hid lust or revenge. By the time Anne returned to England in 1522, her father scarcely recognized her. Gone was the soft-spoken girl who once bowed too deeply. In her place stood a woman who carried herself like a queen long before she wore a crown. Her French gowns shimmered with rebellion. Her voice held the rhythm of command. The courtiers at Henry's palace called her a foreign beauty, exotic and dangerous, though none yet realized how prophetic those words would be. Anne did not come back to be admired. She came back to conquer. She had seen what men would sacrifice for desire, and she had learned that no man, not even a king, was immune. The French had taught her how to play the game. England would soon teach her what it cost to win. When Anne Boleyn returned to the English court, the air felt heavier thick with incense, gossip, and hypocrisy. England was slower than France, colder, its courtiers draped in moral piety that fooled no one. Behind their polished manners hid the same hunger she had seen abroad, the craving for favor, for proximity to power. Only here, the game was played in whispers rather than laughter. She arrived first as lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish wife of King Henry VIII. The queen prayed before dawn and wept in private, her rosaries worn smooth from pleading for another son. Around her, men plotted their futures as quietly as priests plotted salvation. Into this brittle stillness stepped Anne, French in posture, foreign in confidence. She curtsied low, yet her eyes did not lower. They measured every face before her as one might study a chessboard. The courtiers noticed. They spoke of her accent, her dark eyes, her sharp tongue. To the poets she was a muse. to the wives a warning. Within weeks she had drawn the gaze of men who once ignored the ladies of Catherine's circle. She did not flirt openly. She allowed the silence between her words to do the work. The restraint she learned in France became her weapon, an invisible cord that pulled admiration and suspicion in equal measure. Anne understood that in England, charm was safer than beauty. Beauty faded. Wit endured. She quoted scripture to bishops, debated music with ambassadors, and laughed softly at jokes she herself had set in motion. At night, she wrote letters in a neat French hand, practiced her lute, and reminded herself of the vow she had made crossing the Channel: never kneel again. But ambition, once awakened, is a restless companion. Beneath her composure, Anne felt the stirring of an old hunger to be seen, to rise. The king's court was a labyrinth of alliances. The Duke of Norfolk whispered to the Chancellor. The bishop courted the Boleyns for influence, and every smile hid calculation. She studied each faction, aligning herself not by loyalty, but by opportunity. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, saw it too. He encouraged her brilliance, aware that in his daughter's gaze flickered a fire dangerous enough to warm or burn them all. Still, the Queen's household was sacred ground. Anne played her part carefully, dutiful, pious, attentive. Yet even as she served Catherine, she could not ignore the faint pulse of dissatisfaction that ran through the palace. England needed an heir, the king needed hope, and hope often entered the world disguised as temptation. The courtiers sensed it, the coming storm, the shifting of God's order. Anne, patient as a cat, waited at its edge. At court masques and feasts, she moved like smoke among candlelight, never lingering, never offering more than a fleeting glance. When she danced, conversation stopped. When she left, conversation began again. Behind her smile, she carried the memory of the French court's cruelty, a reminder that admiration could turn to ruin overnight. By the winter of 1525, her name was spoken often, and never innocently. Some said she was too clever for her own salvation. Others claimed her blood carried French corruption. Yet none denied her magnetism. Even the Queen, weary and kind, looked upon her with the faint dread of one who senses an omen but cannot name it. Anne Boleyn had become the newest mask in England's theater of power, polished, inscrutable, and already impossible to ignore. Henry Tudor was not accustomed to denial. For years, women had bent beneath his attention as though it were divine favor. But Anne Boleyn was unlike the pliant courtiers who once warmed his throne. She offered him not sweetness, but resistance, and that resistance became the fire that consumed his peace. Their first true encounter was unremarkable in words, yet seismic in consequence. Henry watched her at a masque, her gown a dark shimmer against the gold of the hall. When she danced, she never looked toward him, and that absence of acknowledgement struck him harder than any flirtation could. He sent her small gifts, jewels, ribbons, a brooch shaped like a falcon. Each was returned politely, accompanied by a note written in a hand both delicate and merciless. "Your Majesty's favor does me too much honor. I am unworthy of such treasures." It was rejection wrapped in reverence, the perfect poison. The king began to dream of her. He confessed to his chaplain that Anne Boleyn haunted his prayers. The more she withdrew, the deeper he sank into obsession. At feasts, he watched her from across the table, his laughter forced, his appetite dulled. Courtiers noticed his distraction and adjusted their loyalties accordingly. Catherine of Aragon, ever dutiful, prayed harder. But even she felt the shift, the strange electricity that follows desire before it becomes destruction. Anne's refusal was not chastity. It was calculation. She had seen what became of Henry's mistresses, adored, then discarded, their beauty replaced as easily as wine refilled in a cup. If she were to rise, it could not be through surrender. So she kept him waiting, tormenting him with glimpses of warmth that vanished as quickly as they appeared. She spoke of virtue, of moral restraint, even as her eyes promised something entirely different. Henry, unused to being denied, mistook her patience for purity. It flattered his vanity and justified his longing. Whispers spread through the palace. Some called her a witch. Others said she had trapped the king with the French art. But the truth was simpler. Henry had met a mirror of his own ambition. In Anne, he saw a creature of will and intelligence equal to his own. Her defiance did not insult him. It enthralled him. He believed he could tame her, not realizing that her submission would mean his undoing. By 1526, his letters grew desperate. He wrote of his agony, of sleepless nights, of divine torment. "If you love me half as much as I love you," one letter read, "my heart would burst from joy." Yet Anne still withheld herself. She promised affection but denied access, turning his longing into a political weapon. Each refusal drew him further from reason, and further from his wife, his faith, and his kingdom's stability. When he finally demanded to know what she wanted, her answer came softly, almost reverently. "A crown, your majesty, not a necklace." The audacity stunned him, yet he smiled. For Henry VIII, desire and conquest were one. To make Anne his queen was not a scandal, it was destiny. But destiny, like desire, demands a price. And in that moment, the king began a war not against Rome, nor against his queen, but against the boundaries of God himself. Anne Boleyn had won his heart, and England would bleed for it. Catherine of Aragon had once been the jewel of Spain, a princess of impeccable virtue, wife to a king chosen by God. But by the late 1520s, her beauty had faded into piety, and her silence had become her only weapon. She prayed for Henry's soul, even as he abandoned her. Yet no prayer could stop what had already begun, the slow unraveling of her crown beneath the shadow of Anne Boleyn. The court, ever loyal to power rather than morality, shifted its allegiance like wolves scenting blood. Where Catherine once commanded reverence, she now inspired pity. Servants whispered of her aging body, her barren womb, her desperate faith. Meanwhile, Anne, radiant, young, and cunning, rose from the ranks of ladies-in-waiting to the center of the king's universe. Henry's affection became obsession. His letters grew feverish, his glances possessive. Yet Anne remained elusive, offering the illusion of submission while feeding his hunger for more. She had learned in France that love without control was slavery. And so she controlled him, not through cruelty, but through distance. When he sought her company, she retreated. When he praised her, she spoke of sin and restraint. In denying him, she bound him tighter than any lover could. Catherine, humiliated but unbroken, refused to accept divorce. She called herself the king's lawful wife and God's chosen queen. Her defiance only deepened Henry's fury. The court divided. Bishops took sides, ambassadors carried rumors across Europe, and England's conscience split down the middle. The Pope delayed judgment, fearing to provoke the powerful English crown. But Henry was no longer listening to Rome. He was listening to Anne. In private, Anne began to show her sharp edges. She laughed at Catherine's devotion, mocking the old queen's fasting and penance. She surrounded herself with flatterers, poets, and reformers who whispered that she was England's new dawn, that she would cleanse the court of Spanish corruption and birth a son to restore God's favor. Yet in her heart, a strange unease stirred. She had become what she once despised, the courtesan wielding affection as leverage. And though the king's devotion elevated her, it also trapped her. Every triumph she achieved hung upon his unpredictable desire. By 1529, Catherine's downfall was nearly complete. She was banished from court, her jewels seized, her friends exiled. Anne watched it all with both triumph and terror. The queen's crown glittered before her, yet it gleamed with warning. Catherine had once believed her virtue invincible, and still she had fallen. What protected Anne then but the king's lust? What shielded her but her womb and his need for an heir? On a summer evening, Henry brought Anne to Hampton Court. He kissed her hand before the assembled nobles, an act that made his intentions undeniable. As the courtiers bowed, Catherine's insignia were removed from the palace tapestries. The scent of burning wax filled the hall, as though something sacred had been extinguished. Anne smiled for the crowd, her face serene, her heart pounding with victory and dread. For in that moment she understood. Love had turned to possession, and possession to peril. She had won the king's heart, but lost her own reflection. The courtesan had become the queen in everything but name, and the queen she displaced had become her ghost. The kingdom that once bowed to Rome now trembled beneath the will of a single man, a king who believed his passion holier than the Pope's decree. For Anne Boleyn, the price of love had become the price of faith itself. Henry's desire to make her queen turned into a war against heaven. Cardinals, bishops, and nobles pleaded for reason, but the king heard only Anne's voice, soft, clever, persuasive, whispering of a future where England would answer to no priest but its own sovereign. It was a dangerous promise, and Anne spoke it with the elegance of temptation. In secret chambers, Henry raged that the Pope refused to grant his annulment from Catherine. Years of loyalty meant nothing now. His prayers became curses. When Rome stood firm, he tore his vows apart. "If the Church denies me," he said, "then I shall build my own." And so began the Reformation, not born of doctrine, but of desire. Catherine was cast aside, banished to a cold castle where only her faith kept her alive. The woman who had once worn a Spanish crown now knelt before an English god who seemed to have forgotten her. The people mourned her exile, calling Anne the concubine in whispers that carried through the markets. They spat upon coins bearing her image. Priests called her the serpent that had lured the king from God. Yet in the palace, Henry's love burned hotter. He called Anne his deliverance, his prophecy fulfilled. He wrote verses comparing her to Eve, the woman who brought knowledge to man. He could not see that Eve, too, had been blamed for the fall. In 1533, Thomas Cranmer, Henry's appointed archbishop, declared the king's marriage to Catherine null and his union with Anne lawful in the eyes of God. The ceremony was quiet, private, and trembling with defiance. Anne's hands shook as she placed them in Henry's. She had gained everything she had schemed for, yet in that silence, she felt the weight of something immeasurable. England was bleeding for her, and she could already smell the iron in the air. Beyond the palace walls, monasteries began to close. The king's men stripped churches of gold and saints' relics, melting devotion into coin. Those who protested were hanged or branded as traitors. Even the sacred became corrupt. The streets, filled with fear and prayer, and Anne, watching from her gilded chambers, saw the fire she had sparked consume the land. At night, she walked alone through the halls, hearing the echo of her own ambition. She had promised Henry freedom, and he had taken it, not as salvation, but as weapon. His eyes, once tender, now burned with a different madness, the need to prove his divinity through power. And every act of destruction he performed, he claimed in her name. Anne began to pray again, but her prayers felt hollow. The cross above her bed seemed to watch, not bless. She thought of Catherine's quiet endurance and wondered which of them heaven pitied more, the woman who lost her crown or the one who cursed a nation to wear it. In defying Rome, Henry had given her the crown she craved. But as she stared into the darkened mirror that night, Anne understood the truth. She had not broken the church for love. She had done it for power. And power, once awakened, demanded blood. The crown rested upon Anne's head, but the true weight of it pressed deeper, into her body, her blood, her breath. The court no longer whispered about her wit or her beauty. They spoke only of her womb. England now waited for her to deliver. Salvation wrapped in swaddling cloth, a son to secure the king's rebellion against Rome. Every morning, Anne awoke beneath a ceiling painted with angels, yet she felt watched by vultures. Physicians measured her pulse as if reading a prophecy. Servants knelt, eyes fixed on her belly. Henry came to her chambers not as a husband, but as a pilgrim seeking a miracle. Each time his hand brushed her skin, she felt not love, but expectation. Months passed, and the palace moved in anxious rhythm. Rumors spread that the Queen's child would be male, God's sign of approval for England's new order. But in September 1533, the child arrived, silent and small. Anne wept until she heard the faint cry, the cry of a daughter. They named her Elizabeth. The court fell into stunned quiet. Some smiled with practiced grace, others turned away. Henry's lips tightened when he saw the child. He called her a fair princess, but the words were thin, almost bitter. That night, as fireworks lit the sky, Anne held her newborn close and whispered apologies the infant could not hear. In the days that followed, Anne forced joy into her voice. She thanked God publicly, laughed too brightly at court, and ordered masks to celebrate the birth. But each laugh cut her throat like glass. Behind the curtains, she clutched Elizabeth and trembled, not from fear of Henry's anger, but from the silence that surrounded her. A son would have been greeted by the roar of cannons. For Elizabeth, the guns remained silent. Henry's visits grew shorter. When he looked at Anne, his affection carried the chill of disappointment. "You are young," he would say. "There will be sons." His words, meant to soothe, stung like accusation. Anne nodded, smiling through tears she could not shed before him. The following months were filled with rituals of control. The Queen's diet, sleep, and movements were governed by superstition. Midwives inspected her linens for signs of another pregnancy. Courtiers bowed before her, but their loyalty had turned brittle. Even her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, whispered of her arrogance. Anne prayed again, though her prayers sounded desperate. She begged not for forgiveness, but for fertility, as if God could be bargained with like a courtier. When she miscarried her second child, she hid her grief behind veils. The king was informed, and for the first time, he did not rush to her side. In the quiet of her chamber, Anne looked down at Elizabeth's crib. The child's hair was a pale gold, her eyes sharp even in infancy. "You will survive," Anne whispered, "because I must not fail." The words were both promise and curse. But England had already begun to turn against her. The nobles muttered that God had closed her womb in punishment. Old allies remembered Catherine with newfound holiness. And in the chapel, the priests who once blessed her marriage now prayed for her downfall in silence. Anne stood before her mirror and touched her flat stomach. She had once believed her body was the instrument of destiny. Now it was a battlefield. Each heartbeat felt like a verdict, each breath a reminder that her power was temporary, conditional, and bleeding away. The Queen of England was no longer simply Henry's wife. She had become his gamble. And in the game of crowns, a barren queen was more dangerous than a heretic. By the third year of Anne's reign, the scent of roses in the palace had turned sour. The same halls that once echoed with laughter now carried whispers instead, low, poisonous sounds that crawled beneath the doors like smoke. Anne Boleyn was queen, yet every step she took was measured, every glance dissected. The nobles who had once bowed too deeply now averted their eyes. Henry's court, once dazzled by her wit and fire, began to tire of the flame. The woman who had unseated a queen was now being unseated by rumor. At first, the whispers were subtle, that she was proud, too French, too cunning. Then they grew sharper, that she was cruel, that she mocked the king in private, that she bewitched him with unnatural charms. The people outside the palace walls called her the Witch Queen. Pamphlets spread through taverns like plagues, describing her as a woman with a devil's mark, with 6 fingers and a black cat that followed her shadow. But Anne knew the truth. Her enemies no longer feared her beauty. They feared her mind. She read Latin, debated scripture, and spoke boldly of reform. For the men of the council, it was not her ambition that frightened them, it was her intellect. And so they cloaked their fear in superstition. Within the palace, the poison ran deeper. Servants who once sang her praises now carried secrets for coin. Spies hid among her ladies-in-waiting. Even her brother George was warned to speak carefully. The king's mood was unpredictable, his affections shifting like the wind. Henry himself had changed. The man who had once written love letters filled with poetry now sent messages through his advisors. His body, grown heavy and sore, mirrored his temper, swollen, erratic, and cruel. When Anne failed again to bear a son, he turned to other women with the hunger of a man trying to forget. One evening, Anne entered his chambers to find a jeweled hairpin upon his pillow, not hers. She said nothing. Instead, she smiled, kissed his hand, and spoke softly of loyalty and love. She had learned long ago that rage was a luxury women could not afford. But the silence she kept became her cage. Each smile she forced, each curtsy she offered to those who despised her, was another thread in a web of deceit she could not escape. In the reflection of her mirror, she saw the face of a woman playing a role, not a queen, but a survivor. The pressure grew unbearable. When a court musician joked that the queen's temper could unman the king, he was executed within the week. The message was clear. The throne was not stable, and no one, not even Anne, was beyond suspicion. At night, she would walk the corridors dressed in silks that rustled like whispers, unable to sleep. Her ladies said she prayed for forgiveness. In truth, she was praying for control over her body, her court, her fate. But the palace walls, once a fortress of ambition, now felt like a prison built from secrets and silk. Outside, storms battered the Thames. Inside, the Queen of England trembled, not from fear of death, but from the knowledge that her crown had turned to poison. The same weapon she once wielded against Catherine now consumed her. And though the king still called her, "my love," before the court, his eyes betrayed him. They were already searching for her replacement. Winter settled over Whitehall like a shroud. The corridors that once shimmered with laughter now echoed with silence and the measured tread of guards. Catherine of Aragon was dead, the last obstacle to Anne's legitimacy gone, yet peace did not follow. Instead, a new dread seeped through the walls, colder than any ghost. Anne's triumph should have been absolute. She was queen, crowned and anointed, her daughter named heir by royal decree. Yet the air around her thickened with envy and prayer, whispers that God himself disapproved of the queen's crown. The people muttered that the late Catherine's death was divine retribution, and that England's new queen would not outlive her sins. Anne's own heart began to tremble beneath the weight of rumor. Each morning she dressed in jewels and gold, but behind the veil of power, her hands shook. She had once ruled Henry's thoughts. Now she ruled his temper. His eyes no longer softened when he looked at her. They judged. He blamed her for every shadow that crossed his realm. Failed harvests, unrest, the cries of monks dragged from their cloisters. When Anne miscarried again, the news spread like contagion. Courtiers bowed with sympathy but smiled behind their sleeves. "A punishment from God," they whispered. "The witch's womb is cursed." Henry did not shout. His silence was far worse, the silence of a man already imagining life without her. Desperate to reclaim her influence, Anne threw herself into acts of piety. She read scripture, founded charities, and surrounded herself with scholars who praised her intellect. But her enemies were cleverer. Each act of virtue was twisted into vanity. Even her laughter frightened her ladies-in-waiting, sharp and brittle like broken glass. The palace became a theater of suspicion. No one spoke freely. Servants carried gossip like weapons, trading secrets for gold. When one of Anne's maids was caught spreading rumors, she vanished before dawn. No one asked where she went. Fear had become the queen's most loyal companion. At night, Anne's dreams grew fevered. She saw Catherine's pale face floating in candlelight, her eyes calm, accusing. She saw fires consuming convents, women dragged screaming to rivers for sins she had merely imagined. Sometimes she awoke to the scent of smoke, her heart pounding, convinced that hell itself had crept into her chambers. Henry began to spend more nights away, first on hunts, then in silent feasts, where his gaze lingered too long on other women. When he returned to Anne, his affection was ceremonial, his words rehearsed. "Pray, my love," he would say, "that God grant us mercy." But Anne heard only the echo of doom. One night, she found herself alone in the chapel, the candlelight trembling over marble saints. Her voice broke as she prayed. "Forgive me," she whispered, though she no longer knew for what. For Catherine's crown? For England's ruin? For believing she could command love through power? As she left, she caught sight of her reflection in the gilded altar, eyes hollow, lips trembling. The woman staring back was not the bold courtesan who had once conquered a king. She was a queen haunted by her own victories. Her laughter curdled into fear. Outside, the bells of London tolled for mass. Inside, Anne Boleyn knelt in silence, knowing that she had won everything she desired, and in doing so, had damned herself. It should have been the greatest triumph of Anne Boleyn's life, the moment the world would kneel before her, not as mistress but as England's crowned queen. Yet the coronation of 1533 unfolded like a holy masquerade, gold and incense disguising dread, hymns echoing against walls that already murmured betrayal. From the first light of dawn, London was dressed in splendor. Banners of crimson and gold rippled above the river. Processions wound through the streets. Bishops, courtiers, nobles, all commanded to smile, all careful not to meet the crowd's eyes. The city had been ordered to rejoice, yet the air itself resisted celebration. The people watched in silence. To them, this was not a coronation, but a crime sanctified by ceremony. Anne rode through the streets upon a litter of silver, her gown heavy with jewels, her hair unbound as tradition demanded. The cheers she longed for never came. From the windows of taverns, old women crossed themselves. A man spat into the dust. Somewhere a voice hissed, "God save the true queen." She kept her head high, the practiced smile frozen upon her face. Only she felt the tremor in her hands, hidden beneath silk gloves. She had dreamt of this day for years, and yet every gilded step felt like a punishment. When she entered Westminster Abbey, the choir swelled in reverence. The scent of myrrh and rosewater clung to the air. Anne knelt before the altar as Archbishop Cranmer lifted the crown once worn by Catherine of Aragon, the same crown Henry had sworn no other woman would wear in his lifetime. For a moment, Anne's eyes met the relic's gleam, and she felt the weight of the dead pressing upon her. The crown descended. It was heavier than she imagined. It pressed into her skull until her neck trembled. The Archbishop declared her Queen of England, chosen by God and beloved by her people. A murmur rippled through the crowd, not joy, but disbelief. As she rose, Anne's vision blurred. The candles flickered like flames at an execution. Her breath caught, and for a fleeting instant, she saw the reflection of herself in the gilded mirror beside the altar. The face looking back was not her own. It was Catherine's, serene, patient, eternal. Anne blinked, and the image vanished, leaving only her own pale features, drawn tight with strain. Outside the abbey, Henry watched from his throne, smiling for the courtiers. Yet his smile faltered when he saw Anne approach. She looked radiant, yes, but something in her gaze unsettled him. Perhaps he sensed what she already knew, that this ceremony did not crown love, but entomb it. That night, the palace feasted in her honor. Gold plates gleamed, wine overflowed, and the courtiers toasted the queen who had changed the world. Anne sat beside the king, her lips painted with duty. When he raised his cup to her, she smiled, but her eyes drifted to the mirror behind the dais. In its reflection, she saw the two of them. Henry, bloated with power. Herself, a glittering shadow beside him. Around them, the revelry blurred. the faces of the court melting into faceless masks. She realized then that she had not conquered England. She had become its prisoner, displayed in splendor for all to see. The crown sparkled beneath the torchlight, but it no longer felt like gold. It burned. The crown still gleamed, but its weight had grown unbearable. Months had passed since Anne Boleyn's coronation, yet the music of that day haunted her halls like a ghost no priest could banish. The gold tapestries of Whitehall shimmered in the candlelight, but within, the Queen of England sat alone, her laughter long replaced by silence. Each morning, she woke to the toll of church bells that rang not for celebration, but for confession. The same hands that once trembled with passion now clutched at her rosary. Henry's love, once violent and all-consuming, had begun to cool like a dying hearth. The court whispered of new eyes that pleased the king. They whispered of Anne's temper, her jealousy, her barrenness. And in the shadows, those whispers turned to prayers, prayers that God might undo what lust had made. She had fought to win a throne, but she had no kingdom of peace. When the maids brushed her hair, she saw strands fall like threads of gold severed from a cursed tapestry. Her reflection betrayed her. Dark circles beneath her eyes, the glimmer of something unholy in her smile. She would not admit it aloud, but she feared the mirror more than she feared her enemies. Outside, London still refused to love her. The common folk muttered her name like a sin. In the market, a butcher's wife spat upon the ground and said, "The harlot queen will bring England to ruin." The words reached Anne through servants and spies, and each one struck deeper than the last. She had been adored once, the forbidden woman, who defied a queen. Now she was the crowned temptation that defied God. In the great hall, Henry dined surrounded by flatterers. Anne watched him from across the room, his laughter echoing through the marble, his eyes colder than the silver goblets between them. He no longer sought her counsel. He no longer reached for her hand. She had become another figure in his court, beautiful, necessary, replaceable. At night, she wandered through the palace corridors barefoot, her gown trailing like smoke. Sometimes she heard the cries of Catherine's ladies, though they were long gone. Sometimes she heard the faint cry of an infant, the echo of the son she never bore. When she prayed, she begged not for heaven, but for one more day of Henry's gaze. On the anniversary of her coronation, the bells rang again, not for joy, but obligation. The court celebrated, yet the king did not appear. Alone in her chamber, Anne stood before her mirror, dressed in gold that glimmered like firelight. She traced her fingers over the crown resting upon her head and whispered, "This is the price of desire." The reflection trembled. For an instant, she thought she saw the woman she used to be, laughing, wild, defiant. But the image faded, replaced by the queen, proud, hollow, unyielding. She turned to the window. Below, the river flowed black and endless. Beyond it, the city that refused to forgive her slept under the watch of 1,000 unseen eyes. Anne pressed her palm to the cold glass and watched her breath fog the view. She had climbed to heaven only to find it empty. The courtesan who became a queen had gained everything and lost herself in the golden cage she built. Outside, a wind rose from the Thames, carrying with it the faint toll of distant bells, a warning of what history was already preparing to write. And in that sound, Anne Boleyn stood still, neither triumphant nor broken, only remembered.